Hey kids, this is Chef Jack. I want to thank you for joining me here for the next chapter in our History of Comic Books series. We do appreciate it. In no small part, the history of comics is the history of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg on August 28, 1917 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Austria, as were most of his neighbors. He was a poor street kid who regularly got into fights with his contemporaries. Kirby apparently hated the neighborhood he grew up in and wanted to escape it as quickly as he could. He liked to draw, having taught himself how to by tracing characters from various comic strips and editorial cartoons, and he saw his artwork as a way out of the dreary life his father lived as a worker in a garment factory. He took his inspiration as an artist, and often cited as his primary influences, the artwork of comic strips and political cartoons he saw in the New York newspapers. His particular favorites were the works of Milton Caniff, Hal Foster, and Alex Raymond. At the age of 14, Kirby enrolled at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, but he left after only 1 week. He would later say, "I wasn't the kind of student that Pratt was looking for. They wanted people who could work on something forever, and I didn't want to work on any single thing forever. I wanted to get things done." His first job as an artist came in 1936 when he was hired by the Lincoln Newspaper Syndicate to create comic strips and single-panel advice cartoons for helpful titles like "Your Health Comes First." He did all this under the name Jack Curtis. He used a pseudonym because he was advised by fellow cartoonists that this was a way to avoid exclusive contracts. He would write for one company as one person, for another company as another person, and so on. Kirby would later take great offense to the suggestion that he used all these pseudonyms to hide his Jewishness. He remained at Lincoln until 1939, at which point he was hired by the Fleischer Animation Studios as an in-betweener on their Popeye cartoons. In-betweener is an artist who fills in the action between the major movement frames. Working as an animator turned out not to be to Kirby's taste. He would later say, "I had to get out of there in a hurry because I couldn't take it. It was a factory. In a sense, it was like my father's factory. They were manufacturing pictures." While he was still working at Lincoln, and during his period at Fleischer, Jack Kirby entered the world of comic books when he was hired by Will Eisner and Jerry Iger's company, Syndicated Features Corporation. There, he worked on a number of weekly comic strips. Under the pseudonym Kurt Davis, Kirby created The Diary of Dr. Hayward, a science fiction serial. He also drew an adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo under his previous pseudonym, Jack Curtis, and his first Western comic, Wilton of the West, was produced under the name Fred Sand. He first used the surname Kirby on 2 Lone Rider stories in Famous Funnies number 63 and 64 in October and November of 1939, where he was writing and drawing as Lance Kirby. He finally settled down on Jack Kirby as a permanent pseudonym around 1940 because, he said, it sort of reminded him of James Cagney, of whom he was an enormous fan. Kirby finally got into the superhero business when he went to work for Victor Fox at Fox Features Syndicate, doing artwork for Fox's most popular character, the Blue Beetle, a character that would later be published by first Quality Comics and then by DC. Kirby was jammed into the corner of a small, cramped room where his drawing table sat next to the one used by Bill Everett, the man who would later go on to create Namor the Submariner. Another staff creator at Fox Features Syndicate was Joe Simon, a writer-slash-artist who occasionally moonlit as the company's editor, mostly because Victor Fox was too cheap to hire an actual editor. Simon and Kirby became close friends, and they developed a constant working relationship to the point that when Simon would move from one publishing company to another, Kirby would often follow him. In 1988, Joe Simon would recall, "I loved Jack's work, and the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He asked if we could do some freelance work together, and I was just delighted at the idea. We ended up working together from the second issue of Blue Bolt through about the next 25 years. It was during this time that Kirby finally moved out of his old neighborhood, but ironically, he never left Brooklyn. After moving, he met a girl named Rosalind Goldstein who lived in the same apartment building as he did. The two started dating, and on her 18th birthday, he proposed to her. They were married shortly thereafter. Simon and Kirby's partnership would over time unleash a battalion of comic book stories and characters. In late 1940, Simon and Kirby were hired to work at the newly formed Timely Comics Company, about which the best could be said at that point was that they owned the rights to the Human Torch and the Submariner. Martin Goodman, publisher at Timely, decided that what they needed was more star characters, and Simon and Kirby were tasked with creating them. Many likely projects flowed forth as a result. There was Tuck the Cave Boy, Mercury, The Vision, The Red Raven, Comet Pierce, and finally, the comic for which the team would become most famous among comic book fans and the rest of the world, Captain America. Unlike their previous efforts, Captain America was an immediate success, and I do mean immediate. The first print run of Captain America #1, which was released in March of 1941, sold out in 2 days. 2 days, guys. The second issue's print run was set at over 1 million copies, and it sold out also. The demand for new Captain America material was so great that at one point Simon and Kirby worked for 36 straight hours in order to produce 10 issues, along with the bare-bones outline for a dozen more. During this time, they created most of what we think of as the Captain America mythology. They came up with Bucky and the Young Allies, the Red Skull, and most of the rest of all the background information that follows the character around. Unfortunately, this would also be the end of their relationship with Timely. Simon and Kirby felt that Martin Goodman was not paying the pair the money that they'd been promised, and so they went to National Comics Publications, which would almost immediately be renamed DC Comics. Kirby and Simon negotiated a deal which would earn them a combined $500 a week at National, compared to the combined $160 a week they were getting at Timely. While the two apparently tried to keep their upcoming shift to National a secret, according to Stan Lee, who was an editorial assistant at Timely at that time, everybody who worked there knew precisely what was going on and what was about to happen. The editors at the newly remonikered DC Comics kept the pair busy, and their rate of work, which was fantastically fast at Timely, was even more so now. Simon and Kirby often turned out 6 pages a day, and when necessary, they did more than that. They were penciling, lettering, and inking the pages, and were often scripting them too. DC at the time had a regular stable of writers, but Kirby later admitted that quite often, and here's the quote, the editors would drop off a script, and by the time the editor was downstairs again, that script had gone out the window in the shape of paper airplanes. We wrote for ourselves. During this time, Kirby's most popular characters were the Sandman and the Manhunter. While he and Simon hadn't created either character, they had drastically altered and recreated them from their original visions to the point that they bore little resemblance to their original form. But even more popular were the kid books that featured the Newsboy Legion and the Boy Commandos. The Newsboys, aided by the Guardian, a policeman who fought crime as a superhero, dwelled in the Suicide Slum, an area of an unnamed city that suspiciously resembled the neighborhood in which Kirby grew up. There, they encountered bizarre criminals and, as the war effort grew, Nazi spies as well. The boys were constantly getting into trouble and would have to rely on the Guardian to get them out of it. The Boy Commandos, however, were, if anything, even more popular than the Newsboy Legion, and eventually they were given their own title. Led by Captain Rip Carter, the Boy Commandos fought the Nazis and the Japanese much more directly than did the Newsboy Legion, because they were on the front lines after the U.S. entered the war. And naturally, when the U.S. entered the war, both Kirby and Simon were pulled away from comic books and into military service. Joe Simon went into the Navy, while Jack Kirby was drafted into the Army. He was assigned as a combat infantryman. After basic training at Camp Stewart, Georgia, he was assigned to Company F, 11th Infantry Regiment. As part of the 11th Infantry, he landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. His unit took part in regular combat operations across the European theater. He would later recall that a lieutenant, learning that the famous comic book artist Jack Kirby was under his command, would make Kirby a scout. He'd advance into towns and draw reconnaissance maps and pictures, an extremely dangerous duty. Of his time in military service, he would later say, "I didn't like Army life. I didn't like taking orders and I didn't like discipline. I really didn't like being yelled at. You'd get 10 years for punching a sergeant, so I couldn't punch a sergeant." During the winter of 1944, Kirby suffered severe frostbite on his lower extremities and was evacuated to a hospital in London, England for treatment and recovery. While there, doctors considered amputating his legs, but eventually he recovered to the point that they were saved. He was reassigned to Camp Butner in North Carolina, where he spent the last 6 months of his time in the Army in the motor pool. Kirby was honorably discharged as a private first class on July 20th, 1945, having received a Bronze Star for Valor. After his return to civilian life, Jack Kirby began working at Harvey Comics in a job that Joe Simon had arranged for him. The pair of them stayed at that company until the early 1950s, and while there they created such titles as Boy Explorers Comics, Boy's Ranch, Stuntman, and Captain 3D. The latter was based on the popular 3D movie fad of the 1950s. But what was surprising was that Kirby found his greatest success doing romance comics. He created Young Romance and he took it to Crestwood Publications, where he and Simon asked for 50% of the comic's profits. Surprisingly, Teddy Epstein and Mike Blair, Crestwood's publishers, agreed. Young Romance became Kirby's biggest hit since Captain America, and it sold out 92% of its first issue's print run. The success of this title spurred on the production of spin-off titles like Young Love, and together the titles were regularly selling out nearly 2 million copies a month. Young Romance and Young Love were swiftly joined by Young Brides and In Love, the latter featuring full-length romance stories with recurring characters. Naturally, the success of romance comics spawned dozens of imitators from publishers such as Timely and Fawcett and Quality and Fox. But despite the glut, the Simon and Kirby created romance titles continued to sell millions of copies a month, while their competitors barely scratched by. The money that Jack Kirby earned because of the success of his romance titles would allow him to finally move his family out of Manhattan, all the way out to Long Island. Kirby would work out of a private studio in the basement of his Long Island home for the next 20 years. His wife and children often jokingly called his studio the Dungeon. Unfortunately for the comic books industry, by 1954 things were changing and really not for the better. The entire industry had been undergoing massive upheavals. During this time, Kirby released some of his absolutely best material, but comic books just weren't healthy enough as a medium to support it. The Golden Age had ended, and Dr. Frederick Wortham was testifying in front of Congress. Things were beginning to look bleak. But that, however, will be the subject of our next History of Comics video. Hey kids, it's Chef Jack again. I want to thank you for joining me here for this, the second chapter in the History of Comics tribute to Jack Kirby. As I said before, Kirby had an absolutely monumental influence on comic books, and we're going to delve into it. This time I'm here to talk about Kirby in the Silver Age. In 1953, at the urging of some of their colleagues at Crestwood, the company that was publishing their romance titles, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon founded their own comics company, Mainline Publications. At Mainline, the pair published 4 separate titles: Bullseye, Western Scout; Foxhole, a war title that was being promoted as, created by actual veterans who know the real feel of war; In Love, which they bought from Crestwood; and Police Trap, a crime procedural they claimed was based on genuine accounts by real law enforcement officers. In 1954, they even tried their hand at superheroes again. In response to Timely Comics relaunching Captain America as a commie fighter with a new creative team, Kirby and Simon created the Fighting American. Joe Simon would later say, "We thought we'd show them how to do Captain America right." While the book originally portrayed the Fighting American as a standard dramatic hero who was fighting he was fighting communist villains, In the aftermath of the Army McCarthy hearings and the downfall of Senator Joseph McCarthy, they ended up turning it into a superhero parody. Unfortunately, as happens far too often when friends go into business together, the collapsing comic book market caused money troubles, and money troubles led to interpersonal difficulties, and interpersonal difficulties brought an end to the partnership between Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Simon would leave comics entirely for a new career in advertising, while Kirby continued to do freelance illustrations, cartooning, and comic book art for various companies. In 1971, Kirby would say, "Joe wanted to do other things, but I stuck with the comics. And that was fine. There was no reason to continue the partnership, and we did part as friends." Kirby not only continued to try to sell new comic book ideas to various publishers, he also made a strong push to re-enter the newspaper comic field. For a time, he assisted his friend and neighbor Frank Giancola on Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, a newspaper strip about the U.S. Civil War, but Kirby wanted a strip of his own. He created several during this time, including Master Jeremy, King Masters, and Chip Hardy, but none of them caught on and were either turned down or were canceled shortly after they debuted. He finally found success with a science fiction fantasy strip entitled Sky Masters of the Space Force. Jack Kirby did the pencils, while the Wood brothers handled just about everything else. Wally Wood as inker, Dick Wood and Dave Wood handling the script and the lettering. The strip was fairly popular, and it lasted all the way to 1964. During this time, Kirby also did freelance work on various comics for both DC and for Timely, which by this point had been renamed Atlas Comics. Most of his work freelancing, in fact, was for DC. Between 1954 and 1957, he created nearly 600 pages of content for the company, including an 11-page relaunch for Green Arrow that has since then been almost completely forgotten by comic book fans and historians alike. Which means that, when you gather together with other comic book geeks to talk about which superhero was the first one published during the great superhero resurgence of the early 60s, tell them it wasn't the Flash or Fantastic Four. It was Green Arrow. How's that for a kick in the head, huh? Kirby made a break from DC Comics in early 1958 because of royalty disputes, and because of what Kirby would later call, and I'm quoting, "a bunch of pencil necks telling me my job." We might more accurately call it micromanagement these days. Apparently some of DC's editors had criticized him over small details in his artwork, such as not drawing the shoelaces on a cavalryman's boots, or showing an Indian mounting his horse on the wrong side. This meant that by 1959, Jack Kirby was doing almost all of his work for Atlas Comics, which was soon to be renamed again, this time to Marvel. Atlas Comics' line at the time consisted mostly of romance comics, westerns, and the occasional monster comic, and Kirby was put to work on all three. He drew the Rawhide Kid and the Two-Gun Kid, but most of his time was spent on rather lackluster monster books that featured stories like The Escape of Monsteroso and The Creature from Krogar. This went on until 1961, when suddenly things changed. Over at DC, superheroes were catching on again. Gardner Fox had restarted The Flash and the Green Lantern, and heroes who managed to survive the purge of 1954, namely Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, were beginning to sell again. They were beginning to get popular again. Stan Lee, seeing a change in the wind, went to Atlas's publisher Martin Goodman and got the okay to give superheroes another go. Fantastic Four #1 was released on November 8, 1961, and the comics world would never be the same. This was the beginning of the Marvel Empire. This first issue, yeah, it was a little shaky, the story wasn't the strongest, and several parts of it would later be changed by the way of retconning, but nobody could deny that this was a classic Kirby story. What revolutionized the system was Stan Lee's quote-unquote Marvel method. Instead of beginning with a full script that the artist would then illustrate, each comic began with a basic idea that was discussed between the writer and the artist, and then it was drawn and pasted by the artist as he worked. Dialogue and captions would be added to fit the picture later. The method allowed the artist much more latitude and creative freedom than ever before, but it also required that the artist was, he had to be a really good story man himself. And of course, Jack Kirby was a great story man, on top of being a great artist. Stan Lee, describing this division of labor, would later say, some artists needed a more detailed plot than others, and some, like Jack Kirby, didn't need a plot at all. I'd say to Jack, hey Jack, how about we use Dr. Doom as the villain in the next story, and he'd bring in a finished story that had Dr. Doom in it. Sometimes he'd come in and he would tell me his ideas. All I ever really did to his books was just a little editing. The Marvel method would be the bedrock on which the entire Marvel universe was created. The Incredible Hulk followed the Fantastic Four, and Ant-Man followed the Incredible Hulk. Neither of these two titles was as popular as Fantastic Four was, and in fact the Hulk title would be canceled after only a couple of issues. But, they kept it around long enough for the character to become actually popular. After that, Thor appeared in Journey into Mystery, which was previously a crime/horror title, and the final issue of Amazing Fantasy debuted Marvel's most popular character ever, the Amazing Spider-Man. While Spider-Man was drawn by Steve Ditko and not Jack Kirby, his origins date back to the mid-50s when Simon and Kirby were trying to sell new superheroes to various publishers. Along with Night Fighter, Man of Flame, and dozens of other proposed heroes who never saw print, they came up with a character named Spider-Man. Kirby suggested the name to Marvel, and then worked with Lee to block out the first story. But for reasons that still to this day remain unclear, final production on the issue was given over to Steve Ditko. Now, I'm not complaining about that. Ditko did some remarkable work. I just want everybody to know that the character originated with Kirby. Marvel's last monster book, Tales of Suspense, featured the debut of Iron Man. By this point, Kirby was far too busy to pencil Iron Man's origin story, but he did design the character for Don Heck to draw. Similarly, when Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos debuted, Kirby drew several of the initial issues before turning it over to Dick Ayers. The Avengers and the X-Men were introduced shortly thereafter, and as with Iron Man and Nick Fury, Kirby drew the first several issues to establish momentum before turning them over to other artists who could hopefully keep things going. In the early days of the Marvel Universe, Kirby would often pencil or plot 5 or 6 books a month, but by the mid-60s, Marvel had attracted enough fresh new talent that Kirby could cut back on his workload and he could concentrate on only a handful of titles. At this point, primarily he worked on Fantastic Four and Thor and the newly relaunched Captain America. Cutting down on his workload also resulted in a marked improvement in the quality of his artwork. Before that time, he'd been too rushed to do sufficient backgrounding or to pay very strict attention to the details. But with sufficient time to stretch out his creative muscles, Kirby's art became tighter and much more ornate and all the more dynamic. Through his artwork, for example, he transformed Thor from just another superhero title, albeit one with a mythical bent, into a true saga of the gods with its pageantry and its costumes and its awesome landscapes. Kirby's many years of working like a machine had trained him to be able to do good quickly, and being able to do good quickly meant that when he could take his time, good became fantastic. In the mid-60s, Marvel's characters were beginning to appear on television in a series of cartoons, and they were the subject of many different articles and magazines on the renewed interest of superheroes and comic books in general. Marvel was no longer a small, hole-in-the-wall operation. Jack Kirby found it less and less necessary to come into the office or to even involve himself in the design of new characters or books. It was at this point that he relocated his family to California. He'd mail his penciled pages to Marvel's offices from 3,000 miles away. In 1970, after over 100 issues of the Fantastic Four, Marvel's readers were shocked and dismayed to hear that Jack Kirby had resigned from the company completely in order to take up an editorial post and to create a brand new line of comics for DC. Throughout his life, Kirby had been with Marvel longer than any other company, and his contributions to their history and to their success were substantial and noteworthy. But it was time for a change. Kirby felt that Marvel was stifling him. They gave him no room to experiment anymore. Characters that he had created had been pulled away from him and given to other people. Moreover, Marvel had recently been purchased by a conglomerate, and the new owners didn't even give a damn about the comics. They certainly didn't give a damn about the creators of the comics. He personally felt offended that the new bosses at Marvel didn't even know who he was, much less what he had done to build the dynasty that they had just purchased. He felt that he was being treated shoddily, and to be honest, he was being treated shoddily. So, when Carmen Infantino, DC's Comics editorial director, offered Kirby a means to get out, he jumped at it. But that's the subject of another video. Hey kids, it's Chef Jack again. I want to thank you for joining me for this, the third chapter in the History of Comics tribute to Jack Kirby. By 1969, Kirby had grown increasingly dissatisfied with working at Marvel. Not only was he involved with a lawsuit with the company over ownership of Captain America, a lawsuit, by the way, started by Marvel when Joe Simon registered a copyright renewal for the character, but Kirby had begun to get resentful over the fact that Stan Lee had an increasing media prominence, and he was absolutely angry over Marvel's failure to properly credit him, specifically for his story plotting and his character creations and co-creations. In early 1970, the final straw landed. Marvel presented Kirby with a contract that included a drastic pay decrease and a prohibition against any sort of legal retaliation. Kirby had always sided with the unions and labor when it came to such things, and so he objected. Marvel's management, on the other hand, refused to do any sort of negotiation at all. So when Carmine Infantino offered Jack Kirby a place not only as a writer and an artist, but as an editorial supervisor over at DC, Jack naturally took the offer. Kirby's contract with DC was pretty much open-ended. It required him to work on one existing title, but it gave him the right to choose exactly what title that would be, and in addition, it gave him the freedom to basically come up with whatever else he wanted to do at all. It also gave him the freedom within the scope of that single title to do whatever he wanted to with it. This was something he had been fighting for at Marvel for a decade. Rather than grab one of DC's high-selling, high-profile titles, Kirby instead went the other route. He chose to take over Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, which at the time was DC's worst-selling title. He would later say that he did it for two different reasons. The first reason was Jimmy Olsen at the time did not have a regular creative team, so him coming in would not put anybody out of a job. The second reason was for the challenge. He wanted to see if he could revive a book that was on its last legs. Since the title's start in 1954, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen had primarily been a formulaic humor title aimed at the younger kids. In an attempt to impress his boss, Perry White, and thus earn a job as a real reporter for the Daily Planet, Jimmy Olsen would end up putting himself into some sort of ridiculous danger where naturally he would have to be fished out by his pal, Superman. During the 16 years prior to Kirby taking over, the book had descended further and further into corny silliness, often relying on outlandishly unlikely plots, like the time that Jimmy turned into a human octopus, or the time he turned into a genie, or the time that he turned into a giant turtle man. By 1970, the writing was pretty much on the wall that if something didn't turn around for Jimmy Olsen, the title would be canceled by the middle of that year. Kirby could not have asked for much more of a challenge from any established title at the time, but he saw that as a good thing. When Kirby took possession of the title, he immediately cut down on the corniness and made it more of an action-oriented book. He did keep the sense of humor and the general sense of fun. At one point he had his friend comedian Don Rickles do a cameo, but gone were the outlandish transformations and the formulaic plots. To do this, Kirby used an ace that he had been keeping up his sleeve since the 1940s, the Newsboy Legion and their heroic mentor, the Guardian. And for the first time, Kirby pinned down just where the Newsboys' home neighborhood, the Suicide Slum, was located. He placed it in the poorest parts of Metropolis. In addition, Kirby added such elements as Galaxy Broadcasting Network and its insidious president Morgan Edge. He reintroduced Lucy Lang as a potential love interest, and he used all of these elements to tell much more adventuresome, much more adult-oriented stories. And sales for Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen soared almost immediately. As Jimmy Olsen number 147 was going to press, Kirby found out that he would shortly be relieved of his responsibilities concerning the title. This allowed him to focus more on the project that he'd really been looking forward to doing all along, ever since he first came to DC. The Fourth World. For those of you who are not familiar with the Fourth World, Kirby constructed it as a backdrop against which several of his other stories would be presented. He envisioned it as a finite series of interrelated stories that would have a definite beginning, a definite middle, and a definite end, and would all come together to one single climax. These stories would be collected and then sold in an omnibus edition later on, effectively the first trade paperback edition. To tell the story of the Fourth World, Jack Kirby created the New Gods, the Forever People, and Mr. Miracle, doing art and scripting for all three titles. The New Gods focused on Orion and his war against his father Darkseid, but also told the story of the other gods of New Genesis as well. Mr. Miracle focused on Scott Free, son of the Highfather, who had escaped the clutches of Darkseid to Earth alongside his girlfriend and later wife Barda, and naturally Darkseid's forces followed after him. The Forever People featured the youth of New Genesis and their adventures, harkening back to Kirby's boy gang titles of the 1940s. The three Fourth World titles ran concurrently and were built with a single specific vision. It was nothing like anyone had ever seen before, and it's not something that has been tried all that often ever since. In fact, off the top of my head, the only other example I can think of is Grant Morrison's Seven Soldiers of Victory. The basic themes and plot of the Fourth World story originated back when Kirby was writing the Tales of Asgard stories for Marvel. Kirby wanted to have two planets at war end with Ragnarok, in which everything was destroyed and the universe started over. Ragnarok is the battle that, according to Norse mythology, ends the universe. When Marvel would not let him kill off their then lucrative Thor title, Kirby tried it again with the Inhumans. When Marvel told him that he couldn't do it with the Inhumans, he moved on to the Eternals, with the Eternals versus the Celestials. And again, Marvel said, no, you can't do that. So then he went over to DC, and DC was like, oh, you want to do this? Yeah, sure, go ahead. Here you go. So with the Fourth World, Kirby got to tell the story he always wanted to tell in the original context. As an interesting side note, Kirby kicked off the story of the New Gods with the very same image that ended his run on Thor, a planet torn in half and armored gods holding swords and dying on a fiery background. Of course, then came the problems. To be brutally honest, a lot of the Fourth World is uneven. The art varies in quality. The writing varies in quality. This was not surprising, given that Kirby was writing stories and coordinating them and creating thousands of little details all on his own. It was a juggling act, and as every juggler can tell you, sooner or later you're going to drop a ball. There are times in the various new the New Gods issues, or the Forever People issues, or Mr. Miracle, where it's pretty clear that Kirby has lost track of something, and he's making it up as he goes along. For example, in New Gods number 5, Calabac comes to Earth, but then he disappears, and he stays disappeared for 3 entire issues. As Glenn Gould once said, it was as if Kirby wrote that first story and then forgot about it, and then went back sometime and reread it later and said, whoa, hold on, I'd better do something with him. unfortunately, the problems overcame the appeal. The New Gods were something, they were something nobody had ever seen before. It was definitely a concept that was before its time. The comic book audience in the early 70s, when this was being produced, they wanted superhero stories. They wanted action and adventure. They weren't quite ready for a deep, complicated mythology, especially one that you literally had to read every single issue of, or you would miss a ton of details. One critic that I read likened the Fourth World stories to Lost. It's such a deep, interwoven, complicated story that if you missed a single episode of Lost, you might as well stop watching entirely because you were gone. There was no way for you to catch up. Well, the same sort of thing happened with the New Gods. It just got so complicated for people that they stopped reading. And when they stopped reading, DC, unfortunately, stopped being interested in publishing it. So a lot of what people find attractive about the Fourth World, its scope and its aspirations, all went unexplored because the project was unfortunately canceled by DC because of lack of sales. New Gods and Forever People were canceled after only 11 issues. Mr. Miracle hobbled for an additional 7 issues after that, being canceled after issue 18. On another side note, in 1985, Jack Kirby was given the chance to end the Fourth World saga with an original graphic novel entitled The Hunger Dogs. However, given that he was never given the chance to get past Act 1 in the original story, The Hunger Dogs was doomed from the start. Kirby had planned a long, sprawling epic that would have ended with Orion and Darkseid killing each other. Instead, he was told by DC to rush the ending into a single book, and when the beginning had barely taken off, he was told to keep both Orion and Darkseid alive, not only for further use in other comics, but for merchandise purposes. The final project was stilted and almost unreadable on its own, though it does feature some absolutely beautiful artwork. Jack Kirby continued to produce new material for DC after the cancellation of the Fourth World. Specifically, he created Kamandi and Etrigan the Demon and OMAC and several other innovative titles. Some of his best work was done for Our Fighting Forces and Sergeant Rock, including several stories about which Kirby would later admit that they were his own personal experiences during World War II. But none of these led to any sort of long-term success. Despite some of the most creatively rewarding work of his entire career, when his contract with DC Comics came up for renewal in 1975, Kirby decided to return to the comic book company with which he was most closely associated in the past. But that's the story for our next video. Hey kids, it's Chef Jack again. Thanks for joining me for the next installment of our History of Comics tribute to Jack Kirby. So far we've talked about Jack Kirby's legacy of characters in his comic book series, but now we're going to tackle a completely different part of comic book history. We're going to be looking at the controversy of Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee. When you're a kid and you first get into comic books, inevitably you learn who Stan Lee is. You learn how Stan is perhaps the single most significant author of the pop culture universe in which we all now live. He's the guy who, in a manic burst of imagination nearly 60 years ago, brought into being the Amazing Spider-Man and the Avengers and the X-Men and the Incredible Hulk and the Fantastic Four and dozens of other Marvel characters and Marvel titles he so famously and consequentially penned at Marvel Comics during the early days. But there always comes a time when somebody more knowledgeable than you, an older kid at school or the guy who runs the local comic shop or a blogger with a vendetta, will let you in on a secret. You know Stan Lee, right? Well, let me fill you in on the real shit about him. He screwed over Kirby, he screwed over Ditko, he screwed over all those guys. They were the real creative geniuses behind Marvel. Stan Lee stole everything from him, and now he's rich, and he's famous, and he did it on the backs of the guys who did all the hard work. What you get told is that Stan Lee is nothing more than a talentless hack, a huckster, a loudmouth in an empty suit. And when you ask them to prove it, they inevitably can provide evidence that what they say is true. It makes you begin to question your assumptions. You have to decide for yourself, what is your personal take on this subject? And in any case, your perception of Stan Lee is never the same again. The two sides of this controversy have become amazingly polarizing, with fans basically dividing right up the middle, either supporting Stan Lee or supporting Jack Kirby. And there's, to be honest, there's no real easy solution to it. There really isn't. Personally, I believe that Jack Kirby was robbed of all the credit he should have received. But before I continue this, I want to point something out. Stan Lee's position as a comic book legend is not in doubt. He absolutely deserves every ounce of his fame, every single cent that's in his bank account. He deserves his endless number of fans. He deserves the glory. Stan Lee does not need to defend himself. He certainly doesn't need me to do it. His achievements speak for themselves. And I want to start out with that statement because I'm about to drive a point home with a sledgehammer, and otherwise what follows might get ugly. I want to be clear. Jack Kirby created Marvel Comics, and I'm spelling comics with a small c. Jack Kirby created the pictures, he created the characters, he created the stories. But it was Stan Lee who created Marvel Comics, capitalized. Lee created the shared universe. Lee created the business empire. Anyone who has ever run a business or followed the lives of a great entrepreneur know that this is just as creative an enterprise as writing and drawing stories. So while I'm about to show exactly what happened between Lee and Kirby, I don't want anybody to mistake the fact that Lee deserves the accolades he is getting today. Let's get to the heart of the controversy. To do so, I'm basically going to be concentrating on the Golden Age Fantastic Four title, just, because it's easier to concentrate on one title than to jump around a lot of them. When you look at the credits of these issues, the early issues of Fantastic Four, they all say, written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby. And that appears nice and simple. In the book, The Origins of Marvel Comics, and in a lot of other interviews, Lee would say that he would come up with the broad ideas, not necessarily the specifics. He'd make big, broad ideas, and then he would hand them over to Jack Kirby and the other writers at Marvel, who would then transform them into specific comic book pages. The thing is, there are several problems with Lee's story. First, both before and after the early 1960s, Stan Lee was not exactly known to be the most creative person. Jack Kirby, on the other hand, was well known for producing all kinds of big ideas. And second, Stan Lee was far too busy to write everything. And he'd often just, when he did deliver ideas, it was the faintest outline of an idea. Certainly nothing that you could claim co-writer or, writer or co-writer credit for. In one particular letter to a fan, Stan Lee wrote, "Fantastic Four is easily our favorite book here at the Marvel Bullpen. It is my baby and I love it. People have asked for original scripts, but actually we don't have any. I wrote the story, I go over it with Jack, he draws it up based on our hasty conferences." Note that phrase, hasty conferences. "And then with his drawings in front of me, I write the captions and the dialogue, usually right on the original artwork. It seems to work out well." Stan would often just phone in a suggestion and Jack would do the rest, delivering the pages for dialogue to be added. For example, according to both Kirby and Lee, the ultimate genesis for Fantastic Four number 48, 49, and 50, which was the very first appearance of Galactus, was when Lee called Kirby up on the phone and said something like, "Hey Jack, how about the next time we have Fantastic Four fight God?" And, Jack Kirby responded by bringing in Galactus. I mean, famously, the first time Stan Lee even saw the Silver Surfer was when he asked, "So who's this guy?" About Jack Kirby, Lee has actually said, "Very often, I didn't even know what the hell he was going to give me. I'd get some pages of artwork, and I wrote the copy and turned it into whatever story I wanted it to be, but it was like doing the crossword puzzle. I'd try to figure out what the illustrations meant, and then I'd put in the dialogue and the captions." According to Kirby, he would use blue pencil to put notes in the margins of his artwork with suggestions for dialogue. Stan would then add the actual dialogue and quite often would completely ignore what Kirby wanted. To be fair, Kirby apparently ignored Lee just as often. According to John Romita Sr., Kirby was later able to claim with a straight face that Lee never wrote anything except what Jack put into his margin notes, because Jack Kirby never bothered to read the comic books after he turned his art into Stan Lee. In 1968, Castle Frankenstein magazine published an interview with Stan Lee in which he said, and I quote, "Some artists, such as Jack Kirby, need no plot at all. I mean, I'll just say to Jack, let's have the next villain be Dr. Doom. Or I may not even say that much. He may tell me. And then he goes home and he does it. He is so good at plots, I am sure that he's 1,000 times better than I. He just makes up the plots in these stories. All I do is a little editing. I may tell him he's gone too far in one direction or the other. Of course, occasionally I will give him a plot, and we're practically both the writers on those things." It seems really clear in interviews like these that when Stan Lee says writing, what he means is adding the dialogue to the finished artwork. But it's also just as clear that when Jack Kirby says writing, he means deciding what happens from one panel to the next and adding the notes in the margin as needed. As to Lee's personal creativity, there is a lot of evidence, mostly anecdotal, that it just didn't match Kirby's at all. Stan Goldberg, for example, who wrote for Marvel in the late 60s, once said, "One time I was in Stan's office and I told him, I don't have another plot. Well, I was having a little writer's block and I just couldn't come up with anything. I was hoping Stan could give me an idea to work from. Stan got out of his chair, walked over to me, looked me in the face, and said very seriously, 'I don't ever want to hear you say you can't think up another plot.' And then he walked back and sat down in his chair. He didn't think he needed to tell me anything more." In contrast, Goldberg said this about Kirby, quote, "Jack would sit there at lunch and would tell us these great ideas about what he was going to do next. It was like the ideas were bursting from every pore. It was very interesting because he was a fountain of great ideas." Steve Ditko said, "The fact is, we had no story or idea discussion about Spider-Man books before issue 26, up to when I left the book. Stan never knew what was in my stories until I took in the penciled story cover and my script. Saul Brodsky, his personal assistant, would take it all from me and brought it into Stan's office. I would leave Marvel without once seeing or talking to Stan." Legendary artist Wally Wood goes even further. He said, "I'll never say that Stan Lee isn't a smart man. I mean, he did come up with 2 surefire ideas. The first one was, why not have the artists do all the hard work? And the second was, always sign your name up on the top, big. And the rest was history. Stan Lee, of course, became rich and famous over the bodies of people like Bill and Jack," unquote. By Bill and Jack, of course, he means Bill Everett and Jack Kirby. Bill Everett, for those of you who don't know, created Namor the Submariner. Jack Kirby, of course, created a lot more than that. Gil Kane had a similar opinion of Stan Lee, and I quote, "On each page from 1964 to 1970, next to every single panel, Jack wrote extensive margin notes explaining to Lee what was taking place in the story. It took Jack about 2 weeks to create these pages. It took Lee as little as 2 hours to add the dialogue to Jack's art." Jack Kirby was only paid as an artist, but he felt that he should have been paid much more because he was also contributing story ideas. He believed that he'd been cheated, so he did finally leave Marvel. Years later, in the 1980s, Jack Kirby was fighting to get some of his original artwork back from Marvel, and the two sides became polarized, as I mentioned. Some fans clearly felt that Stan had done everything. Others supported Kirby's claim that Stan had done nothing. Still more felt that their contributions were basically equal. The battle rages to this day. So, in the end, who's right? To be perfectly blunt, Jack Kirby deserved far more credit than he ever received. Now, that said, some things should be pointed out, namely the Black Panther, the X-Men, and Spider-Man. While Kirby did come up with the rough idea for the Black Panther, he wanted to call the character the Coal Tiger. Yeah, the Coal Tiger. In addition, the costume Kirby came up with for this character was, in a word, utterly ridiculous. Lee has said that he unilaterally changed the character's look and the character's name to make him simultaneously more heroic and more menacing, and to seem like he was more powerful, something that no one can deny is exactly what happened with the character in the long run. In regard to the X-Men, there is definitive concrete proof that this was one of the few occasions that Stan Lee brought a fully formed concept to Jack Kirby and said, "Draw this, please." Kirby's contributions to the X-Men's creation was their look, and that was all. Lastly, while Jack Kirby claims credit for creating a quote-unquote early version of Spider-Man, the truth is his early version shares one thing and only one thing in common with the version to come later, and that's the name. Everything else about the character was created by Steve Ditko, which unfortunately means that claiming credit for things you didn't do is not an exclusive trait of Stan Lee. Despite my earlier statement that Stan Lee doesn't need me to defend him, I'm going to defend him a little right now. Stan Lee's fame does not and should not rest on the strength of his writing. Rather, his ultimate talent was as an editor and as a promoter. Nobody has ever promoted the comic book industry like Stan the Man did. That's where his genius lay. This entire Lee versus Kirby controversy arises because of the perception that Lee personally, on his own and by his own devices, screwed Kirby over and made himself rich in the process, leaving Kirby penniless. Lee is portrayed as a con man and a huckster who has little to no input in the comics that made him rich other than signing his name larger than anybody else, while Kirby is portrayed as the hard-working genius who conceived, drew, and wrote everything with little to show for it at the end of his life. The way the comic book industry was set up was not Stan Lee's fault. The work-for-hire credo ensured that most creative types, Jack Kirby included, would have little to show other than their contracted pay rates. And the truth is, at the time, Kirby was the highest paid comic book writer in history. Stan Lee completely changed the way comic books were perceived by the general public. And he did it so that it would be that way forever. Without his vision, no comic book, Marvel, DC, independent, it doesn't matter. No comic book would be seen as the form of entertainment they are today. In a world without Stan Lee, the average comic book reader is what he was in the 1940s and 50s, an 8 to 14-year-old boy who gave up comics the moment he discovered girls. The artists would still be working until their eyesight failed because there would be no medical or financial retirement benefits. And there certainly wouldn't be anything like I Love Comics, where two highly educated and dedicated brothers who are fans of the comic book medium spend hours and hours and hours researching, recording, and presenting videos about comic books because they love them. Because they love them more than just about any other form of entertainment on the planet. And why? Because nobody would care. Nobody would care. That's what Stan Lee did for comics. He made people care about them. Jack Kirby will always be seen as the person who was treated shabbily by Marvel Comics. But that doesn't mean that Stan Lee was the villain of the piece, and he certainly wasn't responsible for Jack Kirby's life circumstances at the time of his death. Kirby was bursting with ideas. He was a genius as both a writer and an artist. But even his closest friends said that he was also, and had always been, an unpleasant, irascible, sarcastic, pushy, bitter, impatient man who could hold a grudge for decades and who was distrustful of everyone, even his friends, sometime to the point of paranoia. And to be honest, a lot of the financial problems Jack Kirby faced in his later years were the fault of one person and one person only: Jack Kirby. Meanwhile, Stan Lee was the guy who never met a stranger he didn't like. He had a kind word and a smile for everybody, and who is now living the high life in Hollywood, glad-handing it with the celebrities. Sympathy for Jack and jealousy of Stan leaves us with the perception that Lee is a dishonest snake who doesn't deserve his current place in society, because that's the narrative everybody wants to hear. So there you go, kids, our look at the Jack Kirby Stan Lee controversy. What did you think? Did you agree with me? Did you disagree with me? Do you think I'm full of it? Do you have information I didn't have? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the video, go ahead and click the like button. If you really like the video, share it with your friends so maybe they can come over and like the video. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that little notification bell that's next to the subscribe button. That way you don't miss any of our videos. If you really like what we're doing here, you want to help us keep the lights on, we have a Patreon page linked below. There is exclusive Patreon content. But even if you don't, I want to thank you for your time and your attention. I do love doing these History of Comics videos. And I know that there's, 4 of you out there who also love watching them. And I appreciate every single one of you. I want you to know. Thank you very, very much for watching.